Welcome to the Ernie Chambers Show.
I'm Ernie Chambers, and I'm going to speak a little bit today about suicide. It's not a pleasant topic, but it's essential that we look into this because greater numbers of young people, especially, are taking their own life. People who know the individual will begin to feel guilt and regret and question himself or herself and say, were there signals that I didn't pick up? Is there something I said that I should not have said? Is there something I didn't say that I ought to have said, should I've done? And none of this is going to change what happened. So as with many bad things, prevention is better than cure. Since none of us is a mind reader, and we cannot know what's going on in a person's mind, let alone his or her life, it's best that this kind of information in terms of obtaining help be put out there for everybody, or try to make it available at least to everybody. So I've got some items that I'm going to read from today. I usually like to speak extemporaneously without notes, but on a topic like this, where there are experts who can be looked to, it's best to let them speak. I'm one of those dinosaurs who still reads the newspaper, but I'll tell you what, if I am a dinosaur, I'd be known as T-Rex, which means the Tyrannosaurus Rex, king of the dinosaurs. But I find ways to get information. I do watch the news, but by reading the newspapers, you can get a fuller presentation of what you want to get about a particular story. There may be articles and special guest editorials that will not appear on television or the gadget, as I call the computer. So today I'm going to be reading some things from the newspaper. This is going back to 2015. For the youngsters out there, 6 years ago is almost a lifetime ago. But for some things, it's not even the batting of an eye. This article appeared on October the 4th, 2015. The headline is Challenges and Responses, Teen Suicides in the Midlands. It's really an editorial. Every 2 hours on average, a kind of bomb goes off somewhere across our nation. And this is from 2015, remember. It comes in the form of a teen suicide. These deaths, averaging 12 a day nationally, rob a young person of his or her life and deliver to members of the family and friends and the school communities. It leaves a lasting concussion. These deaths are preventable in a lot of cases, but to prevent something, you have to know that there's something that needs preventing. In addition to the more than 4,000 US teen deaths each year due to suicide, an annual average of 157,000 young people ages 10 to 24 receive hospital treatment for self-inflicted injuries. If a person deliberately injures himself or herself, something obviously is wrong. Some of these that were just injuries that put people in the hospital, they had to be serious to go to the hospital, were probably attempts at suicide that were unsuccessful. And maybe at a later time, the person who had tried and received only an injury will succeed. The Midlands are by no means immune to this heartbreaking problem. Suicide is the second leading cause of death for youth ages 15 to 19 in both Nebraska and Iowa. This comes from the Nebraska State Suicide Prevention Coalition and the Iowa Department of Public Health. In 2012, 3 years before this article, In 2012, Iowa experienced a spike in teen suicides, claiming the lives of 32 young people and spurring a coordinated statewide response. Last year, which would have been 2014, 14 Nebraska youths took their lives, double the number from the year before. In both states, by no means are teen suicides limited to urban areas only. Rural communities also are afflicted by these tragedies, and Native American communities tend to be hard hit. We have to realize that, and we all were young. I was young a long time ago, but I remember some of the things that happened when I was young, some of the things that troubled me. I spent a lot of my very young years in church. And because of the speaking so much about hell, damnation, burning forever, God killing you, the death angel stalking you, and then Satan coming as a backup, it's almost after all the things that God's going to do to you. If you saw Satan, you'd say, "You're not such a bad fellow," and shake his hand. But at any rate, I felt, and I didn't know the terms for it at that time, tremendous anxiety all the time, uncertainty about whether I would even live to see the sunset. And if I lived to see the sunset, I wondered if I'd live to see it rise. And people used to indicate that when God calls your name, you'll die. I wanted to make sure that if my name was called, I was doing something so I wouldn't hear it. But the anxiety, the depression, the uncertainty, and church was the last place in those days to go to try to get help. In fact, many of the problems that young people suffered, and probably today, stem directly from going to church and the kind of things not only that are spoken about, but the way people behave who are supposed to understand these things, and the apparent meanness that religion puts into people. But going on with this, the challenge is daunting, to be addressed anew with each new generation of young people. Still, there is room for hope, and it's fitting to highlight this issue now at the start of Mental Health Awareness Week. Experts on teen suicide note that a large percentage of crisis situations with teens involve diagnosable conditions such as depression or bipolar disorder, complex matters for sure, but nonetheless subject to treatment. But before there can be treatment, there must be a diagnosis. Before a diagnosis, there must be a visit to a doctor. Before there can be a doctor visit, an adult has to be caring enough or knowledgeable enough to see that this first link in the chain is put in place. Prevention then is vital. The more that adults can understand the warning signs to look for, the better the odds of helping a teenager before things reach a crisis point. A wide range of Nebraskans and Iowans are working hard on this complex issue and deserve commendation for their work. As mentioned, in the wake of the 2012 surge in teen suicides, Iowa officials have worked to develop a coordinated response, even as more can be done to boost the state's education efforts for adults and strengthen treatment programs. In Nebraska, a variety of institutions and officials have stepped forward to tackle the challenge. These efforts include nonprofits, government agencies, medical centers, school systems, and clergy, with the Nebraska State Suicide Prevention Coalition doing invaluable work as the central coordinator. It's something like an octopus which has 8 arms. So I felt like saying 10. An octopus has 8 arms, yet they're called tentacles. That's interesting, isn't it? October means 8, yet it's the 10th month. But anyway, an octopus couldn't operate these tentacles properly if there was not a central brain system that knew where each tentacle was, what it was to do, and could coordinate and cause it to move. So in this sense, It's a good octopus. And they're some of the most intelligent animals, by the way, on the planet Earth. Nebraska communities have used grants to hold awareness events and provide seminars to help adults understand the warning signs. The Kim Foundation has been notably active on this issue. Nebraska took a practical step forward with passage of Legislative Bill 923, sponsored by former State Senator Amanda McGill. The law provides for an hour of suicidal prevention training as part of the annual in-service training for Nebraska Public Schools personnel, including teachers, counselors, and nurses. I don't know if that training is still going on because sometimes a law is passed and those whom it affects will not continue to comply, but I hope this is still in operation. Each day, a bomb in the form of teen suicide goes off around our nation. Sometimes the pain and devastation strike close to home. Let's join together and strengthen our area's ongoing effort to address this issue, saving lives and offering hope. Aren't people talking a lot today about how divided the country is and how we need to come together? Well, it's not going to be any coming together on politics. There'll definitely be no end to the religious wars. The rich will get richer, the poor will get poorer. Those who are the working poor will have to work more than one job to feed his, her, or their family. They will not be able to afford medical care. So the rich get richer and the poor get farther behind. Something we should all be able to agree on is the welfare of our young people. As I state, we all were young at one time. We know the problems that we had, the lack of understanding shown toward us, the cruelty in some cases, in others, sexual abuse, even by family members. So with this background of knowledge that we don't have to read to get, we don't have to put confidence in what somebody else is saying. We can look within ourselves and understand. We can see what happened to those young people we grew up with and know that human beings as a species on this planet is not going, they will not change that much from year to year, decade to decade, century to century, even perhaps eon to eon. So what happened before is happening now. It'll continue to happen. So if we could bury the hatchet, so to speak, not in each other's head or back, but long enough to look at this ongoing, worsening problem, the death of the innocent young people who are not here by choice, then maybe if we began to work together on this, we would see that as we work on this, that so-and-so is not really such a bad person if you can persuade the fool to do something good, but now the fool has been persuaded and maybe he or she is not a total fool after all. And somebody else may begin to have similar movings. And then even though politically they may not disagree, they may not agree, religion-wise, they'll continue to disagree, but they might soften the expression of the disagreement. Then they may not even raise those points of disagreement because they like the cooperation so much that is being done to help our children, that some of these other things begin to fall into the perspective they should have always been in. A lot of sound and fury signifying nothing, as a tale told by an idiot. So it's time to use that brain with which we are to think, gain knowledge, understanding, and wisdom, and learn how to get along as a family. But remember, the first family on earth comprising 4 people, a mother, father, 2 sons, 2 brothers, 1 was a murderer. So bad things can happen, bad things are happening, but they don't have to. This is not something fixed in the stars and the movement of the planets. These are diagnosable problems. They are manageable problems. And if our children could learn to have confidence in us, they would come to us and talk to things that they wish they could talk to us about. And you know what I'm going to do? And this is the way I do when I'm presenting something. I will shift gears. This is going to be about suicide, but I was going to save this for last. It's a column that I wrote in the Omaha Star in 2005. Now, for you young people again, this is 2021. 5 from 21 leaves 16. So this was written 16 years ago. I was trying to address the problem of suicides way back then and even before, and I decided to write a column for the Omaha Star. This is called The Fifth Horseman. Galloping through the book of Revelations is the fearsome quartet known as the Four Horsemen of the Apocalypse: famine, pestilence, destruction, and death. But there is an unidentified fifth horseman, always found with the other four, whose name is equally familiar and dreaded. The fifth horseman sometimes precedes the other four, at other times accompanies them, at still other times follows them. The name of the fifth horseman of the apocalypse is suicide. What is it that leads, lures, coaxes, beguiles, or drives a person headlong into the fatal embrace of suicide? The answers may be as many and varied as the hopeless, despairing, bewildered, terrified, overwhelmed, lost victims. Suicide is the weaver of tragedy and the fashioner of mocking futility. People who are experts on such things proclaim that suicide is the end product of an unheard or ignored cry for help. He that hath ears to hear, she that hath ears to hear, listen and hear. Maybe so, maybe not. I am no expert. The only certainty is that a life is cut short abruptly by a victim's own hand. I knew 3 people who committed suicide, and I did not see it coming in any of those instances. I knew people whose families had a member who committed suicide, and they did not see it coming. For some tormented souls, merely contemplating suicide, along with the imagined sorrow and regret of those who remain alive to mourn, is enough to push them over the brink. When I was in the legislature, a former attorney general used to have a study session, and he would invite school kids from all over the state, and he always wanted me to talk to them. And I would talk about suicide and how when you're young, you have in your mind that if you take your own life, people here are going to be sorry, they'll be regretful, and that you'll somehow be aware of it. But I always emphasize, don't count on it. You may not know anything. So stay here, and as long as you're here, you can do something to try to correct these problems. All of you, as young as you are, have had serious things which at the time it was confronting you, you felt like it was the end of the world, but you got over it. Maybe the prom came, maybe you went to a football game, maybe a friend who hadn't talked to you spoke to you, and you got through something that you thought was the end of the world. Well, you're going to have to realize that even without being conscious of it or putting forth the effort, something may come into your life that will give you ease from that sorrow and whatever it is that is overwhelming. And I would go along like that, and I had much more time than I'm going to take now. And they would come up to me afterward and say that it was helpful. I was always glad, but I couldn't be sure whether it was or not. But continuing. A madman named Nietzsche, whom some call a philosopher, wrote a book, Beyond Good and Evil. This is what he wrote. The thought of suicide is a great consolation. By means of it, one gets successfully through many a bad night. Albert Camus offered two sentences which should be read slowly and digested. The first, there is but one truly serious philosophical problem, that is suicide. That's the first sentence. The second sentence, judging whether life is or is not worth living amounts to answering the fundamental question of philosophy. Is it worth it being here or is it not? Then philosophers try to put the case together, some for one proposition, some for the other, and some just go crazy. Self-killing of a coach's son. I am moved to address this gloomy subject by the suicide December 22nd, 2005, of the death of 18-year-old, the suicide December 22nd of the 18-year-old son of Tony Dungy, head coach of the NFL Indianapolis Colts. Details and commentary are provided by excerpts from Chicago Tribune sports columnist Rick Morrissey's piece reprinted in the December 23rd Omaha World Herald. And this column that I'm reading from was written 6 days after that. Subheadline, he's a father. Wrote Morrissey, quote, Tony Dungy is not a coach today. He is not a Black coach today either, if you're into labels. He's not the coach of the best team in the NFL. He's not an actor in a play we watch every week when you watch football. He's a father today. His biggest decision is not how much to use his starters down the stretch as the Colts get ready for the playoffs. His biggest decision is what clothes to bury his son in and what music to play at his funeral. James Dungy, 18, died Thursday morning near Tampa, Florida, apparently by his own hand. How, when, why? The details will come later. The details matter, of course, but only in the context of giving a father's pain a ghastly form and shape. What matters most is that a father has lost a son. Pain is not a diminishing natural resource. It's hard to fathom Dungy's pain. It's hard to imagine the pain of being locked in an airplane for 2 hours while traveling to identify his son's body. Trapped with your grief 3 days before Christmas. His pain will be on public display. That's not what he signed up for when he became the Colts' head coach in 2002, but that's what he's facing now. We'll watch this unfold because that's what we human beings do. We're a polite people, but we're curious too. You don't have to avert your eyes when the pain is on display on television. The death of Dungy's son will help us keep things in perspective until we don't want perspective anymore. We'll want football back soon. That's us. That's the culture we live in. But for now, please don't tell me about the comparatively trivial inconvenience and athletic achievements of other professionals. Tell me about a father and his son. Strange request for a strange poem. Students visiting the Capitol building frequently request that I talk to them. After addressing a group of teenagers and answering their questions regarding the tragedy and futility of suicide, the victim will have no awareness of what reactions greet this self-killing. One of the adults accompanying them made a strange, almost bizarre request. Could I write a poem about a suicide victim from the perspective of a young girl in her early teens whose parents were insensitive to her problems? I presume she meant a white girl. She wanted the poem to touch on the points I covered during my talk. already you're probably considering what I considered at the time. She grew evasive and her face reddened when I asked if she had a specific child and dysfunctional family in mind. I didn't push it, but said something like, "What you ask is extremely difficult. Obviously, I've never been a young girl, and it has been so many years since I was a teen that I may as well not have been one of those either, but I'll try." Although she seemed grateful and relieved, she failed even to acknowledge receiving the copy of the poem I sent her. The suicide of young Dungy reminded me of that poem. Why? When a child commits suicide, parents, regardless of how attentive and good they may have been, are racked by guilt and second guessing. What did they do wrong? What did they fail to do that they should have done? Why were they blind to the signals? Such questions have no satisfactory or definitive answers. Adolescence is a wrenching, turbulent time of life. No one can see inside the mind of a young person and divine precisely what is there. Often, the young person herself or himself could not articulate coherently what is in the mind. Maybe he or she would manage some stumbling words about the confusion, uncertainty, self-doubt, fears, frustrations, feelings of inadequacy, and similar movings that torment and trouble the mind of the young. And we know who are older and have not erased it all from our memory. In some regrettable cases, parents may indeed have played a crucial role in triggering the chain of events terminating in self-killing. In most, they did not. But in the same way that tortured adolescents must come to grips with their inner torments, so must the parents of young suicide victims. And I'm going to read the poem that I wrote, and it's called The Last Page. It's written, remember, she asked me to write it the way a young girl would write it who is contemplating taking her life. And as I said, but I didn't say it to her, I presumed she meant a young white girl. And I wrote this 12 years before Dungy's son committed suicide. And when he committed suicide, then it reminded me of this thing that I'd written all those years ago. This is what she writes in her diary. How I love my sainted mother, but I can't stand my mean-faced brother. Next to mother, I love daddy, but my sister's way too catty. Family stuff we always did to make us each a good little kid. Television we would watch, eating pizza and drinking Cokes. On the couch, my dad would stretch. How I hated to see him scratch. He would scratch his foot, then sniff his hand. He was such a grossed out man, but I loved him just the same. After all, I have his name. Also, parents do strange stuff. Then they want to give us gruff. Just because, like a silly kid, we might do the stuff they did. Really, when you get right down, I'll bet they cut a trail through town. Why do parents always think they're some kind of know-all shrink? Think if we sink or swim, we're acting just like them. They're too quick to call us bad, thinking we had the time they had. There's an example I often give. It's where this boy's father was always on him about not getting good enough grades. He said, but daddy, I'm getting 95s. He said, that's not good enough. So then finally he brought all of his grades up. Every paper he turned in got 100%. And you know what his father said? Well, it took you long enough to do it. And it just crushed him. But going on with this young white girl writing in her diary, And this is what she's putting in her diary. In such angry tones they speak, calling me a tramp or a sneak, thinking I do what I shouldn't because they may have tried but couldn't. How I wish they'd lend a hand and try just once to understand. Digressing, I talked to a whole lot of school kids, and most of them were white, and they would talk to me like I was a father confessor. They told me about the problems they had, and I'd always respond that adults don't always understand. They got a lot of things on their mind. And in the same way, you might hurt one of your best friend's feelings without realizing it, or sometimes even intentionally, but you make up and get over it. They may not even be aware that they're hurting your feelings. They got to pay rent. They got to pay for the doctor. They got to buy you school clothes, feed you every day. And you yourself know how hard you are to get along with. Try to throw in something that might make them smile. I said, so when these things happen, don't think it's always done intentionally. Just realize that grown people don't necessarily get smarter as we get older. As a matter of fact, the way the earth was created was okay. But when it came to putting human beings on it, human beings should come into the world when they're 100 years old. And the kids would look and look puzzled. I say, mm-hmm. Then the longer they live in the world, the younger they get, the less mean they get, the less hateful they get, the more innocent they become. And when it's finally over, they're little crawling babies, totally innocent, and they crawl into oblivion without a thought or care. And try to put their minds on a path different from what it might always run when you discuss the relationship between parents and their children. And we were not always adults. We were not always parents. We were children. And sometimes we ought to think back to how it was. And in the same way we didn't want to have to go through that, we should not want to put any child through it, whether it's our own child who we have around us all the time, or some other child we may just happen to cross paths with. But anyway, let me continue. We're no worse, I'm pretty sure, than they were. Nobody is pure. When they yell, you little flirt, they don't care how much I hurt. Always taking me to task, never do they stop to ask what I think or how I feel. Don't they know my heart's not steel? They're so quick to say you lie. How I wish that I could die. Sometimes words won't come my way. I don't know just what to say. If I said you hurt my heart, they just yell, stop getting smart. I don't let them see me cry. How I wish that I could die. Do they try to be so mean? I can't ask them anything. When I've done the best I can, I'm not even in their plan. When they yell, you cause us grief. Getting away is such a relief. When gray sky is full of clouds, in my mind, they're funeral shrouds. On long walks, I wonder why, seemingly, it's good to die. Friends no longer want to be going anywhere with me. Always you're so sad, they say. Most of them have drifted away. Hours and day I sit alone. You're becoming skin and bones, yell my parents. Is it dope? Now I know there is no hope. I'm a cinder in their eye. I believe it's time to die. Diary, when I'm sad and blue, I can always turn to you. I won't run from death and hide. Comforting is suicide. You have been my only friend. With these words, we both shall end. That's the best I could do in trying to write something about suicide from the standpoint of a young white girl. But now, let me go on with some of these things that the experts have said. This is from November 26th, of 2020, still way back there in the dark ages. It was in the World Herald, and the headline was Suicide Prevention Efforts Can Save Young Lives. A subheadline, we must all reach out to the youth of our community with positive, helpful, managing along with the services and connections they desperately need right now. And it gives some of the things that can be looked into in order not to just run away and go way over time. I'm going to read some of these three areas where increased awareness can lead to a change. First, mental health first aid. Like a traditional first aid class, mental health first aid teaches participants how to identify when someone may be experiencing a mental health emergency and how to help that person. Classes available through Nebraska's Region 6 Behavioral Health Services include discussions on recognizing symptoms of depression, anxiety, psychosis, and addiction, then determining the right way to assist. It's a training everyone should have, just like they started emphasizing CPR. Number two, early access to mental health care. Project Harmony's Connections program brings therapists, schools, students, and parents together to provide accessible preventative mental health care to Omaha area children. Connections works directly with families as well as school and medical professionals to identify children in need of mental health support. Children are matched with community therapists who are trained in evidence-based practices. And on those who need mental health care, they can be people we'd never think had that problem. The number 2 tennis player in the world is named Osaka. I can't remember her first name, but she got tired of going to these press conferences after every match, which she would always win. She said the reporters would ask the same questions, that she felt tense, nervous, she didn't want to be bothered. So she skipped one of them and they fined her $10,000 or $15,000. She said, all right, if that's the way you're going to do it, I'm going to look out for my own welfare, my own mental health. I tried to tell you what a problem it is for me, and it made no difference. She was talking to those who are in charge of tennis. After that tournament she was in, it may have been the US Open or one of those, Wimbledon in England, one of the big ones was coming up next, and she told them she's withdrawing. Her mental health meant more to her than playing tennis. And the people who should understand understood so little, she just had to get away. So she didn't play in Wimbledon. Her mother is Japanese. Her father is an African from one of the islands. I don't say African American, Cuban, or any of the others. The term African is the one from which white people derive the term for us, whether we're from a country on the African continent or not. But her father was a Black man, and she was going to play for Japan, represent Japan in the Olympics. She was looking forward to it. She thought it would really cleanse away a lot of things, but in the third round, she was eliminated. So maybe she wasn't able to overcome those mental health problems. Another young woman, now Osaka would be considered a young woman of color. In some people's eyes, undoubtedly an African American. Her name is Simone Biles. She did moves that nobody had done before. She had won more gold medals than anybody, won more championships than anybody, and she's only 24. So she went to this Olympics, and everybody looked for great things from her. And the first few routines she was in, it looked like she was going to live up to it. Then she was going to do the vault. That's where you run down the runway, you hit the spring, jump up, put your hands on this table. She did flips and spins in the air like only men did, but this time she lost what they call her air orientation. She couldn't picture where she was because she was spinning and flipping, and she'd done it 1,000 times, so to speak. And when she landed almost in a crouch, and she stood up, but she didn't look really together, and she raised her arms like you have to do, and she walked off. Then she announced that she was withdrawing from the team competition, that she didn't have confidence in her own self. She didn't say all this at first. Some people thought she had sustained an injury because it seemed like one of her legs collapsed when she landed from that vault, but it was really a mental health issue. She withdrew from the team end of it, but she stayed there and cheered the other girls on, and some of them she had worked with. So she didn't pout and go home, and everybody was still wondering. Then she did announce that it was a mental health issue. She had to look out for herself and take care of that. And her team and the people in gymnastics all rallied to her. There were some women who had won gold medals as gymnasts who pointed out the pressure that you're under. And they admired her from having enough courage to frankly acknowledge to herself first what the problem was, then act in such a way that would be responsible and caring for her teammates, because she could have performed and maybe drawn down the whole team, but she let it go. They thought the next day, when it's called going for the all-around championship, where you do all of the individual items, but it's for yourself, she withdrew from that too. And then she sent out a tweet. It was words to the effect that the outpouring of love and understanding meant so much to her because it told her that she was more than just her accomplishments and the things that she had done in gymnastics. There's a football player that some who don't follow gymnastics who might know. His name is Aaron Rodgers, and he plays for the Green Bay Packers. He publicly praised her for what she did, gave her backing, and condemned those people who had started putting things on social media immediately. She's not strong enough. She's too weak. She's a quitter. She let her team down. And that's when the professionals in sports and in the entertainment world came to her assistance and supported her. And it will help make her whole, and she may be able to perform again. But if she chooses not to, it will be on her own terms. One of the worst things to do, and maybe in the future, I'll talk some more about suicide, but I've said most of what needed to be said, in my opinion. People will stop worrying so much about what other people say and think. The misconception that people have is to call that being self-conscious. No, you're not self-conscious. You're other people conscious, conscious of what you think they're saying. So I'm going to use 3 people, then I'm out of here. First, I'm going to go to a young white boy. He said, I got to think now. I learned my lesson well. You see, you can't please everyone, so you got to please yourself. Then there's Otis Redding sitting on the dock of the bay. I can't do what 10 people tell me to do, so I guess I'll remain the same. In other words, Otis is going to do what Otis says Otis ought to do. Then the one I always like to quote, and I won't defile her by trying to sing, and that's Whitney Houston. She says that learning to love yourself is the greatest love of all. And if I fail, if I succeed, at least I did as I believe. No matter what they take from me, they can't take away my dignity. And if you don't let people take away your dignity, you will never fall into that valley of depression where you then will take your own life and be one of those suicide statistics. I'll probably at some future date talk to you again.
Thank you for watching The Ernie Chambers Show. If you'd like to make suggestions, email us at ewcfacts@gmail.com. That's ewcfacts@gmail.com. This has been an EWC Communication production.